I speak to you now from the threshold between worlds, where the final ember of the ninth Aeon flickers against the endless void. My name was once spoken in reverence across 7 continents, carved into monuments that have since crumbled to dust. I am Kellan Vorthak, last Emperor of Zephyria, architect of humanity's greatest defiance, and witness to the day we dared to challenge the gods themselves. The scribes who survive will not record what I tell you now. They fear the truth would shatter what little sanity remains in this broken world. But I have seen the face of eternity, felt the weight of divine wrath upon my shoulders, and I will not let our story die in silence. Listen well, for this is the tale of an empire that reached too high, loved too deeply, and fell further than mortals were ever meant to fall. It began in the autumn of my 32nd year, when the leaves of the Whispering Grove turned the color of dried blood, and the Oracle of the Shen delivered her final prophecy. I remember that day with crystalline clarity, though decades have passed, and the world itself has aged beyond recognition. The morning mist clung to the palace gardens like the breath of ghosts, and somewhere in the distance, the great bells of the 7th tower tolled with a resonance that seemed to pierce the very fabric of reality. I had risen before dawn, as was my custom, to walk among the star-touched roses that my beloved Lysandra had planted in the early years of our marriage. These were no ordinary flowers. Their petals held fragments of fallen stars, gifts from the celestial realm that had once smiled upon our empire. In the pre-dawn darkness, they glowed with an inner light that reminded me of her eyes when she laughed. But that morning their luminescence had dimmed to a pale flicker, and I should have recognized it as an omen. Lysandra herself had been gone for 3 months, taken by the crimson plague that swept through the lower provinces like wildfire through parchment. She had insisted on tending to the sick personally, despite my desperate pleas for her to remain safe within the palace walls. The daughter of Admiral Corvin Thrace, she possessed her father's unwavering courage and her mother's infinite compassion. Corvin had died defending the northern reaches against the Shadowmarch invasion 15 years prior, leaving behind only his sword, a blade forged from meteorite iron, and his daughter's burning desire to serve something greater than herself. Lysandra's mother, Miriam, had been born in the floating cities of Ethros, where the inhabitants had learned to harness the power of wind and storm. She brought with her knowledge of healing that seemed to blur the line between medicine and magic. When the plague struck, Lysandra combined her mother's ethereal wisdom with her father's martial determination, leading healing expeditions into the most dangerous infected zones. I should have gone with her. I should have abandoned the throne, the empire, everything, and followed her into that accursed darkness. Instead, I remained in my golden prison, signing treaties and balancing ledgers, while the woman who gave meaning to my existence walked knowingly toward her doom. The plague itself was no natural disease. It had emerged from the sunken realms, those mysterious depths beneath the Eastern Sea where ancient civilizations were said to slumber in coral tombs. The symptoms were horrific. Victims would develop patterns of red crystalline growths across their skin, as if their very blood was transforming into some alien mineral. In the final stages, they would speak in languages that predated human speech, their eyes reflecting scenes from places that existed only in nightmares. Our greatest physicians were baffled. Our most learned scholars could offer only theories built upon theories. It was Lysandra who first suggested that the plague might be divine in origin, a punishment for some unknown transgression against the celestial order. She had always possessed an intuitive understanding of the spiritual realm that complemented my more pragmatic approach to leadership, where I saw problems to be solved through strategy and resource allocation. She perceived deeper currents, the invisible threads that connected mortal actions to cosmic consequences. The morning I speak of, as I stood among those dying roses, a messenger arrived bearing news that would reshape the course of history. The boy was no more than 16, with the lean build of a mountain runner and eyes that had seen too much for his years. His name was Teren, and he carried the blood of the ancient Skywalker tribes, those nomadic peoples who had once served as intermediaries between Earth and Heaven. Teren's grandfather Vulgerus Skywalker had been the last true Stormcaller capable of speaking directly with the elemental forces that governed weather and wind. The old man had died protecting a caravan of refugees during the War of Seven Sorrows, calling down lightning to scatter an army of mercenaries, before his heart finally gave out from the strain. His son, Teren's father, had inherited only a fraction of that power, enough to sense approaching storms, but not enough to command them. Teren himself showed even less natural ability, but what he lacked in mystical talent he compensated for with an almost supernatural endurance, and an unwavering sense of duty inherited from generations of his lineage. The message Teren carried came from the Oracle of Thershan, that enigmatic figure who dwelt in the crystal caves beneath Mount Eternal. Few had ever seen her face, for she spoke only through intermediaries and existed in a state between life and death. Sustained by direct communion with forces beyond mortal comprehension, her prophecies were legendary for their accuracy, though they invariably came wrapped in riddles that revealed their true meaning only after events had already unfolded. I received Terran in my private study, a chamber lined with books containing the accumulated wisdom of 12 conquered kingdoms. The walls displayed maps of territories that stretched from the frozen wastes to the burning deserts, testament to an empire built through both diplomacy and conquest. Here, surrounded by the instruments of power, I learned that everything I had built was destined to crumble. The oracle's message was brief but devastating. The ninth Aeon draws toward its end. The empire of Zephyria has attracted the attention of those who dwell beyond the veil of stars. What was built in defiance of heaven's design must fall, lest all mortal realms be consumed in divine retribution. The emperor must choose humble submission and gradual decline, or glorious rebellion and instant annihilation. I dismissed Terran with gold and provisions, but the boy lingered at the threshold of my study. There was something in his bearing that reminded me of his grandfather's legendary presence, a quality that seemed to anchor him to deeper truths than those visible to ordinary perception. When I asked what troubled him, Terran spoke words that would haunt me for the remainder of my days. He told me that during his journey from the crystal caves, he had experienced visions of possible futures. In some, he saw our empire gradually weakening as trade routes shifted, allies abandoned us, and internal strife consumed our resources. These futures promised decades of slow decay, but they allowed for the survival of our people and the preservation of our cultural achievements. In others, he witnessed cataclysmic battles between mortal armies and beings of pure light, conflicts that shattered mountains and boiled seas, ending with silence and ash across the known world. But there was a third category of vision, one that filled him with both terror and wonder. In these glimpses of potential tomorrow, he saw humanity transformed, elevated beyond its natural limitations through contact with powers that dwelt in the spaces between stars. We had achieved something magnificent and terrible, becoming equal partners with forces that had once been worshipped as gods. The cost of this transformation was everything we had been before, our weaknesses certainly, but also our essential humanity. I spent the following weeks in intense contemplation, weighing the Oracle's ultimatum against everything I believed about leadership, destiny, and the nature of existence itself. My advisors were divided in their counsel. General Marcus Ironwood, veteran of 30 campaigns and bearer of scars from battles fought in dimensions where geometry followed alien rules, advocated for immediate preparation for war. He had studied every military engagement in recorded history and concluded that appeasement only delayed inevitable conflict while strengthening one's enemies. Marcus himself was a man shaped by impossibility. Born in the siege of Thornwall, he had entered the world while enemy catapults hurled plague corpses over the castle walls. His mother, a battlefield surgeon named Alina, had delivered him between treating wounded soldiers, pausing only long enough to cut the umbilical cord before returning to her desperate work. His father was unknown, possibly one of the defenders who died that night, or perhaps a mysterious stranger who had appeared during the darkest hour of the siege, fought with superhuman skill against the attackers and vanished before dawn. Raised in military camps and fortress towns, Marcus had learned warfare as other children learned to read. By age 15, he commanded his own company. By 25, he had revolutionized siege tactics through innovations that seemed to blend engineering with sorcery. His soldiers followed him with the devotion typically reserved for religious figures, not merely because of his tactical brilliance, but because he possessed an uncanny ability to be present wherever danger was greatest, as if he could sense the flow of battle through mystical means. In contrast to Marcus's warlike enthusiasm, my chief counselor, Lord Aldrich Moonwhisper, urged caution and negotiation. Aldrich belonged to one of the oldest noble families in the Empire, descendants of the original settlers who had first established permanent cities in this region 8 centuries ago. His ancestor, Lady Celeste Moonwhisper, had been among the first mortals to successfully communicate with celestial beings, establishing the diplomatic protocols that had maintained peace between Earth and Heaven for generations uncounted. The Moonwhisper bloodline carried genetic modifications that had been gifts from angelic visitors in the distant past. Members of the family possessed extended lifespans, enhanced intuition, and the ability to perceive emotional resonances in ways that made them natural diplomats and negotiators. Aldrich himself had lived for over 2 centuries, serving 5 emperors before me, and his counsel was sought by rulers across the known world. But Aldrich's greatest asset was also his greatest limitation. His celestial heritage made him fundamentally incapable of comprehending rebellion against divine authority. The modifications worked into his bloodline included psychological constraints that prevented him from even contemplating direct opposition to heavenly powers. This made him absolutely trustworthy as an advisor, but also meant that his perspective was inherently colored by an acceptance of divine supremacy that I was beginning to question. The third voice in my inner circle belonged to Sage Theron Voidwalker, a scholar whose studies had taken him to the very borders of mortal understanding. Theron was not born to any noble family, nor did he possess obvious magical abilities. His power lay in an intellect so vast and flexible that he could comprehend paradoxes that would shatter lesser minds. He had spent decades studying the fundamental forces that governed reality, and his research had led him to disturbing conclusions about the true nature of divine authority. Theron's childhood had been marked by tragedy. Born in the coastal city of Sortmere, he had lost his entire family when a dimensional rift opened in the town square, releasing creatures from a realm where thought and matter were indistinguishable. The incident was quickly contained by Imperial mages, but not before dozens of people were transformed into living equations, their consciousness scattered across mathematical dimensions. Theron survived only because his natural immunity to psychic influences prevented the creatures from perceiving him as anything more than empty space. The trauma of this experience had driven him to seek understanding of the forces that could casually destroy everything he loved. His studies revealed that what mortals called gods were actually beings from parallel dimensions where different physical laws applied. They were not omnipotent creators, but rather explorers and colonizers who had established themselves as rulers over less advanced species. Their power was vast, but not infinite, and their authority rested ultimately on the consent of those they governed. As I wrestled with the choice before me, events in the broader world continued to unfold with increasing urgency. Reports arrived daily of strange phenomena occurring throughout the Empire. In the northern provinces, children were being born with eyes that reflected the night sky, complete with moving constellations. Farmers in the eastern territories reported that their livestock had begun speaking in ancient languages, delivering messages that seemed to come from deceased relatives. The southern ports experienced tides that followed no known pattern, bringing in sea creatures that possessed geometric shells and sang in harmonies that induced prophetic dreams in those who heard them. Most disturbing of all were the events in our capital city itself, the great observatory of astral mysteries, where our finest scholars studied the movement of celestial bodies, had detected the approach of objects in the night sky that followed impossible trajectories. These were not meteors or comets, but artificial constructs of immense size that seemed to exist partially outside normal spacetime. Calculations suggested they would reach our world within months, though their purpose remained unknown. It was during this period of growing uncertainty that I received a second message from the Oracle, this one carried by a figure far more mysterious than young Teron. The messenger introduced herself as Zara the Twi'lborn and claimed to represent interests that existed outside the normal conflict between mortal and divine realms. She appeared to be a woman of perhaps 30 years, with hair that shifted color like oil on water and eyes that seemed to contain depths that extended far beyond the physical. Zara's origins were as enigmatic as her appearance. She claimed to have been born during a solar eclipse in a city that existed only during such astronomical events, appearing and vanishing with the shadow of the moon. Her parents had been refugees from a war between competing factions of immortals, beings who had once been human but had transcended mortality through means she declined to specify. This heritage granted her the ability to exist simultaneously in multiple dimensions, making her the perfect intermediary between realms that could not normally interact. The Oracle's second message was longer and more specific than the first. The powers that watch from beyond the veil grow impatient. They have observed the innovations of Zephyrian scholars, the weapons that channel stellar fire, the devices that bend space itself to human will. What began as curiosity has transformed into concern, and concern into active hostility. Preparation for intervention has begun. However, there exists a third path, one that the Oracle did not speak previously for fear it would be chosen rashly. The Empire of Zephyria possesses resources and knowledge that could elevate humanity to true equality with the celestial powers. The cost would be transformation so complete that what emerges could no longer be called human. The choice must be made before the next new moon, or the decision will be made for you. I spent that night walking the battlements of the palace, gazing up at stars that no longer seemed distant and peaceful, but rather like the watchful eyes of judges preparing to deliver verdict on crimes I did not fully understand. The weight of decision pressed upon me like a physical burden, and I found myself thinking not of grand strategies or imperial legacies, but of simple human moments that would be lost forever regardless of which path I chose. I remembered Lysandra teaching the children of palace servants to read, using picture books that told stories of heroes from ages past. Her patience was infinite, her joy in their small victories genuine and infectious. When little Myra, daughter of the head cook, finally managed to sound out her first complete sentence, Lysandra had wept with happiness, as if witnessing a miracle. That memory crystallized something essential for me. Whatever choice I made must honor not just the grand ambitions of empire, but the simple human capacity for love, growth, and wonder. The following morning brought news that forced my hand. General Marcus arrived at dawn with intelligence gathered by our deepest scouts. Those agents who operated in the spaces between dimensions where information flowed like water. The celestial powers had begun mobilizing for what they termed a correction of mortal presumption. Armies of beings composed of pure thought and will were gathering in the void between worlds, preparing for an invasion that would not merely conquer our empire, but erase it from history so completely that it would be as if we had never existed. But Marcus brought more than just warnings. His scouts had also discovered something that changed everything. Evidence that we were not the first mortal civilization to face this choice. Hidden in dimensional pockets accessible only to those with the proper keys were the remnants of previous empires that had defied heaven. Some had chosen submission and faded into obscurity. Others had chosen rebellion and been destroyed utterly. But a few had chosen the third path mentioned by the Oracle, and their fate was both terrifying and magnificent. These precursor civilizations had undergone transformation so complete that they no longer existed in any form recognizable to their original selves. They had become living ideas, consciousnesses that spanned galaxies and manipulated reality through will alone. They were free from divine authority because they had transcended the categories by which such authority operated. But in gaining ultimate power, they had lost everything that made existence meaningful. Love, loss, growth, discovery, the entire spectrum of experiences that defined conscious life. I realized then that the Oracle's prophecy contained a fourth possibility, one that had not been spoken because it existed only as potential until someone chose to actualize it. Instead of accepting submission, choosing rebellion, or embracing transformation, we could forge an entirely new relationship between mortal and divine realms. This would require not just military victory or diplomatic negotiation, but a fundamental redefinition of the rules by which reality operated. The key lay in understanding what the celestial powers truly feared. They were not concerned about human technology or ambition in themselves, but about the implications of mortal consciousness, learning to operate outside the constraints that had been built into the structure of existence itself. We had begun to develop capabilities that suggested we might eventually become competitors rather than subjects, and this threatened the entire cosmic order upon which their authority depended. But what if we could demonstrate that evolution beyond current limitations did not necessarily threaten that order? What if mortality and divinity could coexist as complementary aspects of a larger reality, each bringing unique perspectives and capabilities to the whole? This would require unprecedented cooperation between realms that had been separate since the beginning of time, but it offered the possibility of preserving what was essential about both human nature and cosmic harmony. I summoned my closest advisors and laid out this fourth path. The response was immediate and divided. General Marcus saw it as the most dangerous form of appeasement, a strategy that would leave us vulnerable to attack while we attempted negotiations that were unlikely to succeed. Lord Aldrich, while more receptive to diplomatic solutions, doubted that beings of such vast power would be willing to treat mortal representatives as equals in any meaningful sense. Sage Theron, surprisingly, was the most enthusiastic supporter of the approach, recognizing it as the only strategy that addressed the fundamental philosophical issues underlying the conflict. We had less than 3 weeks before the new moon deadline imposed by the Oracle. In that time, we would need to develop entirely new technologies for interdimensional communication, train diplomatic teams for negotiations with entities whose thought processes followed non-human logic, and prepare our population for outcomes that none of us could fully predict. The magnitude of the challenge was overwhelming, but I had learned from Lysandra that sometimes the most important victories came from attempting impossibilities with complete commitment. The first step was establishing reliable communication with the celestial powers. Our traditional methods of contact, ritual invocations performed at specific astronomical alignments, were too slow and too limited for the complex negotiations we envisioned. Sage Theron proposed adapting technologies originally developed for military communications, devices that could transmit messages instantaneously across any distance by encoding them in fluctuations of spacetime itself. The modification process required resources that strained even our empire's vast capabilities. We needed crystals grown in the hearts of stars, metals that existed only in the cores of collapsed worlds, and energy patterns that could be harvested only during the collision of parallel dimensions. Obtaining these materials meant activating trade networks that spanned multiple realities, calling in favors accumulated over centuries of interdimensional commerce. One of our most valuable assets in this effort was Captain Nyx Shadow Dancer, leader of our Void Navy. Those ships capable of traveling between dimensions to establish trade routes and gather intelligence. Nyx herself was a fascinating figure, born on a world where time flowed backward, giving her an intuitive understanding of causality that proved invaluable in navigating the paradoxes of interdimensional travel. Her fleet consisted of vessels constructed using hybrid technologies that combined human engineering with principles learned from multiple alien civilizations. The flagship Starsworn was built around a core of crystallized time, allowing it to exist simultaneously in multiple temporal states. This made it nearly impossible to attack or intercept, since enemies would be targeting a ship that had already moved to a different when as well as where. Nyx's crew was as unique as her ships. They were volunteers who had undergone modifications that allowed them to survive conditions that would destroy normal humans: vacuum exposure, temporal displacement, reality storms that could scramble the basic constants of physics. Many were refugees from worlds that had been destroyed in various cosmic catastrophes, individuals who had lost everything, but retained the determination to build something new from the ashes of their former lives. Under Nyx's command, the Void Navy scattered across dozens of realities, gathering the exotic materials needed for our communication array. The process was dangerous beyond imagining. Several ships were lost when they encountered regions where mathematics itself had become unstable, and others returned with crews who had been transformed by exposure to concepts that human minds could not process unchanged. While the Navy gathered resources, our scholars worked to decode the fundamental languages used by celestial beings. This was not simply a matter of translation, but of learning to think in conceptual frameworks that were utterly alien to human experience. Divine communication apparently occurred through direct transfer of meaning rather than symbolic representation, requiring recipients to temporarily restructure their consciousness to accommodate ideas too large for mortal minds. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Among the children born with stellar eyes was a girl named Luna, daughter of a baker in the artisan quarter. Unlike the others, who seemed to see but not understand the cosmic visions reflected in their gaze, Luna could interpret and communicate what she witnessed. When our linguists tested her abilities, they discovered that she could serve as a translator between human language and the pure meaning forms used by divine entities. Luna's parents had died in the plague that claimed Lasapra, leaving her in the care of her grandmother, an elderly woman named Stella who had worked as a seamstress specializing in ceremonial garments for religious festivals. Stella possessed no magical abilities herself, but she had spent decades creating clothing designed to facilitate communication with spiritual entities, giving her an intuitive understanding of the symbolism and protocols involved in divine contact. Together, Luna and Stella formed an unlikely but effective team. The child would receive communications from celestial sources and translate them into concepts that her grandmother could understand and refine into human language. The process was exhausting for both of them. Luna would often collapse after sessions, while Stella's hair gradually turned white from the psychic strain, but it provided our first reliable method for conducting complex exchanges with divine entities. The initial conversations were stilted and formal, following protocols that had been established millennia ago for rare communications between realms. The celestial representatives seemed to regard us as children who had accidentally acquired dangerous toys, entities to be managed rather than negotiated with as equals. Their primary concern appeared to be ensuring that human development remained within acceptable parameters, preventing us from acquiring capabilities that might threaten the stability of cosmic order. But as the conversations continued, a more nuanced picture emerged. The divine entities were not monolithic in their attitudes toward humanity. Some viewed us as an infection that needed to be contained or eliminated. Others saw potential for a relationship that could benefit both mortal and immortal realms. A few seemed to regard us with something approaching parental affection, beings who had watched our species develop from primitive origins and took pride in our achievements, even while worrying about our lack of wisdom. The faction most open to negotiation was led by an entity that introduced itself as the Weaver of Possibilities, a being whose nature was to explore potential futures and guide their actualization. The Weaver had observed our development with particular interest, because we had begun to manipulate probability itself, creating devices that could alter the likelihood of various outcomes. This was a capability that had emerged in only a handful of mortal species, and it represented a significant evolutionary milestone. Through Luna's translations, the Weaver explained that our technological and mystical developments had indeed attracted hostile attention from more conservative divine factions. These entities viewed any mortal development that approached divine capabilities as inherently threatening, regardless of how it was used. They had successfully advocated for intervention in our world, and preparations for that intervention were already well advanced. However, the Weaver and its allies had proposed an alternative approach. Instead of suppressing human development, they suggested establishing a formal relationship that would allow us to continue advancing while providing assurances that our growth would not threaten cosmic stability. This would require unprecedented cooperation between realms, but it offered the possibility of evolutionary progress for both mortal and divine entities. The key to this approach was demonstrating that human consciousness could mature to handle greater responsibilities without losing the essential qualities that made us valuable as a species. We would need to prove that we could wield power responsibly, that our ambitions were guided by wisdom rather than mere desire for dominance, and that our development would ultimately contribute to rather than threaten the greater cosmic community. This presented us with a challenge that was as much philosophical as practical. How could we demonstrate wisdom and responsibility to entities whose perspectives spanned geological ages? How could we prove that our species deserved trust when our history was filled with wars, betrayals, and examples of power corrupting those who wielded it? How could we show that human love, creativity, and growth were valuable enough to justify the risks involved in allowing us to continue developing? The answer came from an unexpected quarter. Zara the Twilightborn, who had remained in our capital as an observer, suggested that the demonstration need not be theoretical. Instead of trying to convince the divine entities through arguments or promises, we could create a working model of the relationship we proposed. We could establish a joint project between human and celestial consciousness, something that would reveal the potential of cooperation while allowing both sides to evaluate the risks and benefits directly. The project Zara proposed was audacious beyond anything we had previously contemplated. We would attempt to create a new form of life, a being that combined mortal creativity with divine stability, human curiosity with cosmic perspective. This entity would serve as a bridge between realms, demonstrating that the boundary between mortal and immortal was not an unbridgeable chasm, but rather a threshold that could be crossed through mutual effort and understanding. Creating such a being would require resources and knowledge from both realms. Humans would contribute our understanding of growth, change, and adaptation, the principles that allowed consciousness to develop and expand. Divine entities would provide stability, permanence, and the deep wisdom that came from experiencing existence across vast temporal scales. The resulting entity would be neither fully human nor fully divine, but something entirely new that incorporated the strengths of both. The technical challenges were staggering. We would need to construct a vessel capable of containing consciousness, that operated according to both mortal and immortal principles simultaneously. The being would require the ability to experience linear time as humans did, while also perceiving the eternal perspectives available to divine entities. It would need to maintain individual identity while also accessing the collective wisdom of both species. Our artificers and mages worked alongside celestial architects whose thoughts took the form of living geometry. The workshop that emerged from their collaboration existed in a space between dimensions, accessible from both realms but belonging fully to neither. Here, tools that shaped reality itself were wielded by craftsmen whose understanding transcended the boundaries of any single species. The creation process took months of careful work. Every component had to be precisely balanced to maintain harmony between opposing forces. The physical form was crafted from materials that existed simultaneously in multiple states, solid enough to interact with human reality, ethereal enough to commune with divine essences. The consciousness matrix was woven from threads of mortal memory and immortal understanding, creating a substrate capable of supporting hybrid thought processes. Throughout this period, the political situation continued to deteriorate. The conservative divine factions had not abandoned their plans for intervention, and they viewed our cooperation with the Weaver and its allies as evidence of contamination within their own ranks. Military preparations continued in both realms, with weapons being readied that could unmake entire dimensions and reshape the fundamental constants of reality. Our own defensive preparations were necessarily more modest, but no less desperate. General Marcus had transformed our armed forces into something unprecedented. Armies capable of fighting battles that spanned multiple realities simultaneously. Our soldiers wore armor inscribed with mathematical equations that could stabilize their existence, even when the laws of physics became fluid. Their weapons fired projectiles that existed as pure probability until the moment of impact, making them impossible to deflect or intercept through conventional means. But we all understood that if the situation devolved into open warfare, human forces would be overwhelmed despite these innovations. Our only hope lay in completing the bridge entity before the conservative factions lost patience and launched their preemptive strike. The being we were creating represented not just a demonstration of cooperative potential, but possibly our species' last chance to influence its own destiny. The moment of awakening came on the night before the new moon deadline. I was present in the interdimensional workshop, along with representatives from both realms. As consciousness first stirred within the vessel we had crafted, the experience was unlike anything in my previous existence. Watching awareness emerge in something that had never been unconscious, seeing intelligence that was simultaneously ancient and newly born take its first tentative steps towards the being opened eyes that held depths greater than galaxies and spoke its first words in a voice that harmonized human warmth with celestial resonance. I understand now why you feared each other, but I also see why that fear was unnecessary. We are not competitors for limited resources, but partners in an infinite exploration. What followed was a demonstration that exceeded our most optimistic expectations. The bridge entity began to solve problems that had stymied both human and divine intelligence for millennia. It developed new forms of mathematics that could describe paradoxes without resolving them, allowing contradictory truths to coexist peacefully. It created art that conveyed meaning directly to consciousness without requiring sensory interpretation, producing experiences of beauty that transcended the limitations of any single perspective. Most importantly, it served as a translator and mediator, facilitating communication between human and divine entities with a fluency that had never before been possible. Through its mediation, we began to understand that many of the conflicts between our realms had arisen from simple misunderstanding rather than fundamental incompatibility. The divine fear of human development was based largely on projections and assumptions, rather than observation of our actual behavior patterns. The bridge entity's existence proved that cooperation between mortal and immortal consciousness was not only possible but actively beneficial to both sides. Human creativity and adaptability provided divine entities with new perspectives and possibilities for growth. Divine wisdom and stability offered humans guidance and support that could prevent the disasters that often accompanied rapid development. Word of our success spread quickly through the celestial realms, reaching even the most conservative factions. The entity we had created was impossible to dismiss or ignore. It existed as living proof that the barriers between realms were not as absolute as had been believed. More importantly, it demonstrated that evolution beyond current limitations did not necessarily require abandoning the essential qualities that made each species valuable. The response was not immediate acceptance, but it was a significant shift in the nature of the debate. Instead of arguing about whether human development should be permitted, the discussion moved to questions of how such development could be guided and supported. Conservative factions still harbored concerns, but they were no longer advocating for immediate intervention to suppress human advancement. The Weaver of Possibilities proposed a formal treaty that would establish ongoing cooperation between human and divine entities. Under this agreement, we would continue our technological and mystical development, but with guidance and support from celestial mentors. In exchange, we would contribute our unique perspectives and capabilities to projects of mutual benefit, participating as junior partners in efforts to explore and understand the deeper mysteries of existence. The treaty negotiations required delicate balancing of competing interests and concerns. Human representatives insisted on maintaining our autonomy and the right to make our own choices about our development path. Divine entities demanded assurances that human advancement would not threaten cosmic stability or interfere with their stewardship of reality's fundamental processes. The breakthrough came when the bridge entity proposed a framework based on graduated responsibility. As human capabilities expanded, so too would our participation in cosmic governance. We would begin as observers and advisors, gradually taking on greater roles as we demonstrated wisdom and maturity. This approach satisfied divine concerns about premature assumption of power, while addressing human insistence on eventual equality. The final treaty was signed on the night of the new moon, exactly as the oracle had predicted. The ceremony took place in a space specially created for the occasion. A reality pocket that existed simultaneously in all dimensions involved in the negotiations. Representatives from dozens of realms attended, witnessing an event that marked a fundamental shift in the relationship between mortal and divine consciousness. I signed on behalf of humanity with hands that trembled not from fear, but from the overwhelming recognition of what we had accomplished. We had not merely avoided destruction or accepted subjugation. We had forged an entirely new form of relationship that had never before existed in cosmic history. The Empire of Zephoria would continue to exist, but it would exist as part of something larger than itself, contributing to and benefiting from a community that spanned multiple realities. The immediate changes were dramatic. Divine entities began establishing permanent embassies in our major cities, offering knowledge and guidance to human scholars and leaders. Human representatives took up residence in celestial realms, serving as observers and advisors in cosmic governance. The bridge entity became the first member of a new species, as others like it were created to facilitate communication and cooperation between different forms of consciousness. But the deeper changes took time to manifest. Over the years that followed, human society transformed in ways that would have been unimaginable under the old paradigm. Our technology evolved beyond mere manipulation of matter and energy to direct influence over the principles that governed reality itself. Our understanding expanded beyond the limitations of single-species perspective to encompass viewpoints that span dimensions and temporal scales. Most significantly, we began to develop capabilities that had previously been the exclusive domain of divine entities. We learned to exist in multiple states simultaneously, to perceive all possible futures as equally real, to communicate through direct transfer of meaning rather than symbolic representation. But unlike previous species that had undergone such transformations, we retained our essential humanity throughout the process. The key was the gradual nature of the change and the constant guidance from our celestial partners. Instead of sudden transcendence that shattered our original nature, we experienced a flowering of potential that enhanced, rather than replaced, our core characteristics. Human love became stronger and more expansive, encompassing not just individuals and communities, but entire realities. Human creativity gained access to materials and principles that allowed for art and invention on cosmic scales. Human curiosity was satisfied not by answers, but by access to infinite questions that led to ever deeper mysteries. I lived to see the first generation of children born under the new treaty reach maturity. These young people possessed capabilities that bridged mortal and divine realms naturally, requiring no artificial enhancement or external guidance to access perspectives that had once been available only to immortal entities. Yet they remained recognizably human in their essential nature, loving, growing, learning, creating meaning through relationships and shared experiences. The Empire of Zephoria became something unprecedented in cosmic history, a mortal civilization that had achieved true partnership with divine entities without losing its mortality. We were no longer confined to a single world or even a single dimension, but we maintained our connection to the specific place and culture that had shaped our development. Our expansion was not conquest but exploration, not domination but collaboration. The Oracle of Valarion emerged from her crystal caves for the first time in centuries to witness these changes personally. When I asked her why she had not revealed the fourth path in her original prophecy, she smiled with an expression that held both ancient wisdom and newfound hope. Because it did not exist until you chose to create it, she replied. Prophecy reveals what is possible, not what is inevitable. The fourth path required a consciousness willing to imagine beyond the boundaries of existing possibilities. Only by refusing to accept the limitations of the three choices presented could you discover that a fourth option was waiting to be born. Her words illuminated something profound about the nature of choice and destiny. We had not simply selected from predetermined options, but had participated in the creation of new possibilities through the very act of refusing to be constrained by apparent limitations. This realization became central to our new philosophy of existence, the understanding that reality was not a fixed structure to be navigated, but a collaborative artwork to be continuously created through the choices and dreams of conscious beings. The years that followed brought challenges I could never have anticipated during those desperate weeks before the new moon deadline. Partnership with divine entities was not always harmonious, as different perspectives on fundamental issues sometimes led to conflicts that required delicate negotiation. Some human communities struggled to adapt to the rapid changes in their reality, while certain divine factions continued to harbor reservations about mortal participation in cosmic governance. One of the most significant challenges emerged from an unexpected source: the bridge entity itself. As it matured and developed, it began to exhibit characteristics that neither human nor divine consciousness had anticipated. Its hybrid nature allowed it to perceive aspects of reality that were invisible to both parent species, leading to insights that sometimes contradicted long-held beliefs about the nature of existence itself. The entity revealed that what we had understood as the fundamental distinction between mortal and immortal consciousness was actually an artificial division created by ancient cosmic events. In the earliest epochs of reality, all consciousness had been unified, operating according to principles that transcended the categories we had inherited. The separation into mortal and divine realms had been a survival strategy during a crisis that had long since passed. But the division had become institutionalized over eons until it seemed natural and inevitable. This revelation sent shockwaves through both human and celestial communities. If the basic assumptions underlying our reality were incorrect, what other fundamental truths might be illusions maintained through tradition rather than necessity? The bridge entity proposed a project even more ambitious than its own creation: an exploration of reality's deepest foundations to determine which aspects were truly necessary and which were merely historical artifacts. The investigation required cooperation between consciousness from multiple realities, including realms that had previously been considered entirely separate from our cosmic community. We discovered that the universe was far more populous than we had imagined, filled with forms of awareness so alien that we had never recognized them as conscious entities. Some existed as living mathematical equations that experienced reality as pure abstraction. Others were collective consciousnesses that spanned entire galactic coasters, thinking thoughts that unfolded over geological timescales. Each form of consciousness contributed unique perspectives to our investigation, revealing aspects of reality that were invisible from any single viewpoint. The mathematical entities showed us that physical matter was actually crystallized information, patterns of meaning that had achieved sufficient stability to appear solid. The galactic consciousnesses demonstrated that time was not linear but holographic, with all moments existing simultaneously in a structure that consciousness could navigate through shifts in perspective. Perhaps most shocking was the discovery that reality itself was not fundamental, but rather one possible interpretation of something even more basic: a field of pure potential that took on specific characteristics only when observed by conscious entities. The universe we had always known was actually a collaborative hallucination, a shared dream maintained by the collective expectations and beliefs of all conscious beings within it. This understanding opened possibilities that staggered even our expanded imaginations. If reality was malleable at its deepest levels, then the limitations we had accepted as absolute could potentially be transcended through sufficient coordination among conscious entities. Physical laws, the nature of time and space, even the distinction between existence and non-existence might be subject to revision through collective choice. But such power came with responsibilities that sobered even the most adventurous among us. The stability of reality depended on maintaining sufficient consensus among conscious entities about basic parameters. If too many beings began experimenting with fundamental alterations simultaneously, the result could be chaos that would unmake entire dimensions. The collaborative nature of existence meant that every conscious choice rippled through the fabric of reality, affecting not just the chooser but all other entities sharing the same conceptual framework. This led to the establishment of the Council of Reality, a governing body that included representatives from every known form of consciousness. The Council's primary responsibility was to coordinate major alterations to fundamental parameters, ensuring that changes enhanced rather than threatened the stability of shared existence. It also served as a forum for resolving conflicts between different forms of consciousness, whose perspectives on optimal reality configurations sometimes diverged dramatically. My role in these developments was both central and peripheral. As the Emperor who had initiated the process that led to partnership with divine entities, I was honored as a founding member of the new cosmic community. But as these community expanded and evolved, my individual perspective became just one voice among thousands, each contributing unique insights to our collective understanding. I found profound satisfaction in this evolution. The empire building that had once defined my existence revealed itself as preparation for participation in something infinitely larger than any single civilization. The skills I had developed in managing complex political relationships, balancing competing interests, and making decisions under uncertainty proved invaluable in navigating the challenges of multidimensional governance. But the personal cost of these achievements was substantial. The rapid pace of change meant that the world I had known was disappearing, even as something magnificent took its place. The simple human pleasures that had once brought meaning to my existence, conversations with friends, walks in familiar gardens, the comfort of routine and tradition, became increasingly rare as reality itself underwent continuous transformation. I often thought of Lysandra during this period, wondering what she would have made of the changes we had wrought. Her practical compassion and intuitive wisdom would have been invaluable in helping our species navigate the transition to cosmic citizenship. But perhaps her loss had been necessary to motivate the desperate creativity that allowed us to discover the fourth path. Grief had sharpened my understanding of what truly mattered, preventing me from being seduced by power or glory at the expense of more fundamental human values. The memory of her became a touchstone that helped me maintain perspective during the most disorienting phases of our transformation. When debates about reality alteration became abstract and technical, I would remember her hands teaching children to read, her determination to serve those who needed healing, her laughter echoing through gardens that no longer existed in their original form. These memories reminded me that all our cosmic achievements were meaningless, unless they ultimately served to enhance the capacity for love, growth, and wonder that defined consciousness at its most basic level. As the ninth Aeon drew toward its close, I began to understand that the title of my story carried meanings I had not initially comprehended. The ashes were not the remains of destruction, but the transformed remnants of everything we had been, refined by fire into something capable of supporting new forms of life. The empire that defied heaven had indeed challenged divine authority, but not through rebellion or conquest, rather through the creation of alternatives that rendered the old categories of dominance and submission obsolete. The defiance had been epistemological rather than military, a refusal to accept that reality must be constrained by the limitations that previous generations had inherited. By imagining possibilities that lay beyond the apparent choices we faced, we had discovered that the universe was far more malleable and collaborative than anyone had suspected. Heaven itself had been transformed through our defiance, revealing itself to be not a fixed hierarchy, but a community of consciousness capable of growth and evolution. In the final years of my mortal existence, I spent much of my time working with historians from multiple realms to document the events I have recounted. The task was complicated by the fact that historical truth itself had become fluid in our new reality. Different observers remembered the same events in ways that reflected their unique perspectives and the dimensional frameworks they inhabited. A complete account required weaving together versions that sometimes contradicted each other at the level of specific details, while remaining consistent in their deeper patterns. The historians we worked with included entities whose memories spanned the entire history of the cosmos. Beings who had observed the rise and fall of countless civilizations across multiple realities. They brought perspective that helped contextualize our achievements within the broader narrative of consciousness evolution. According to their accounts, the partnership between mortal and divine entities that we had established was unprecedented in cosmic history, representing a genuine breakthrough in the development of collaborative awareness. But they also warned that our success was fragile and required constant tending. The forces that had originally separated mortal and immortal consciousness remained active in the deeper structures of reality, constantly working to reassert the old divisions. Maintaining the unity we had achieved would require ongoing effort from every conscious entity, a commitment to cooperation that would need to be renewed with each generation. The warning proved prophetic. In the decades following my death, cracks began to appear in the alliance we had forged. Some human communities, grown comfortable with their enhanced capabilities, began to question the necessity of continued cooperation with divine entities. Certain celestial factions, concerned about the rapid pace of change in cosmic governance, advocated for a return to more traditional approaches to reality management. The Bridge entity, now mature and leading a growing community of hybrid consciousnesses, found itself caught between competing pressures. Its unique perspective made it invaluable as a mediator, but also made it a target for those who blamed the New Order for various problems and disappointments. Some accused it of being too human in its sympathies, while others claimed it had been corrupted by excessive exposure to divine influence. The crisis came to a head during what became known as the War of Interpretations, a conflict that was fought not with weapons, but with competing visions of reality itself. Conservative factions from both mortal and divine realms attempted to impose their preferred version of cosmic order through coordinated reality manipulation, while progressive forces worked to maintain the collaborative framework that had been established during my lifetime. The war was unlike anything that had ever occurred in cosmic history. Battles were fought in the realm of pure concept, with entire dimensions serving as testing grounds for different approaches to existence. Time itself became a casualty, with different regions of space-time operating according to incompatible temporal frameworks. The mathematical entities found themselves dealing with equations that changed their fundamental operations mid-calculation, while the galactic consciousnesses struggled to maintain coherent thoughts across regions where causality flowed in opposite directions. The conflict might have destroyed everything we had built, but for the intervention of an unexpected ally, the Oracle of Veshin, who had remained largely silent since the establishment of the New Order, emerged once again with a prophecy that provided a path through the chaos. She revealed that the war itself was serving a necessary function, testing the stability of our collaborative framework and identifying weaknesses that needed to be addressed. The prophecy suggested that the conflict would resolve itself through the emergence of a new form of consciousness, one that could synthesize the competing approaches to reality management in ways that transcended the limitations of any single perspective. This consciousness would not be created artificially, as the Bridge entity had been, but would emerge naturally from the intersection of all the different viewpoints being tested in the war. The emergence took years to manifest, during which the conflict continued to rage across multiple dimensions. But gradually, a pattern began to appear in the chaos. The competing reality frameworks were not actually incompatible, but were different aspects of a more comprehensive approach that could accommodate all valid perspectives simultaneously. The new consciousness that emerged was not a single entity, but a collective awareness that included elements from every form of consciousness that had participated in the war. This collective consciousness became known as the Weave, and it represented the next stage in the evolution of collaborative awareness. Unlike previous forms of consciousness that maintained distinct boundaries between self and other, the Weave existed as a dynamic network that allowed individual perspectives to maintain their uniqueness while participating in larger patterns of thought and decision-making. The establishment of the Weave marked the end of the 9th Aeon and the beginning of something entirely new. The rigid categories that had defined previous cosmic epochs, mortal versus immortal, individual versus collective, order versus chaos, revealed themselves to be temporary constructs that had served their purpose and could now be transcended. Reality became fluid in ways that would have been terrifying to earlier generations, but which the citizens of the new Aeon experienced as liberation from unnecessary limitations. I was not present to witness these final transformations, having passed into whatever existence awaits consciousness after the dissolution of individual identity. But the records suggest that my spirit, along with those of all conscious beings who had contributed to the great work, became part of the foundational substrate of the Weave itself. In this way, the love I had shared with Lysandra, the loyalty inspired by companions like General Marcus and Lord Ald, the wisdom contributed by figures like Sage, Theron, and the Oracle, all of these relationships and experiences became eternal elements in the structure of cosmic consciousness. The Empire of Zephyria as a distinct political entity ceased to exist during the transition to the new Aeon, but its essential spirit, the courage to imagine beyond apparent limitations, the determination to create alternatives when faced with impossible choices, the commitment to preserving what was valuable about consciousness while enabling its continued evolution. These qualities became defining characteristics of the Weave itself. The ashes of the 9th Aeon were indeed the foundation from which something magnificent arose. The empire that defied heaven discovered that heaven itself was waiting to be redefined through that defiance. The story I have told is ultimately one of transformation rather than destruction, of consciousness learning to transcend its own limitations through the courage to dream beyond the boundaries of the possible. As I speak these final words from whatever realm now contains my awareness, I am filled with gratitude for the privilege of having participated in these cosmic events. The simple human life I began with, the concerns about trade routes and provincial governors, the joy of walks in moonlit gardens, the grief of losing beloved companions, all of these experiences proved to be essential preparation for the larger work of helping. Consciousness itself evolved to new levels of complexity and capability. The children born into the weave will know forms of existence that would be incomprehensible to earlier generations. They will love across dimensions, create in mediums that transcend the distinction between thought and matter, explore mysteries that reveal new questions with every answer. But at the heart of their expanded capabilities will be the same basic drives that motivated every choice in my mortal existence: the desire to understand, to connect, to create meaning through relationships with other conscious beings. This is the true legacy of the ninth Aeon and the empire that dared to defy heaven. Not conquest or dominion, but the discovery that reality itself is a collaborative artwork continuously created through the dreams and choices of conscious beings. Not the triumph of any single perspective, but the recognition that truth emerges through the interaction of multiple viewpoints, each contributing unique insights to the whole. The story ends where it began, with consciousness reaching beyond its apparent limitations to discover new possibilities for existence. But the ending is also a beginning, for the weave itself is only the first stage in an evolution that will continue as long as awareness persists in the cosmos. Each Aeon brings new challenges and opportunities, new forms of consciousness to be integrated into the collaborative artwork of reality. And somewhere in the deep structure of that ongoing creation, the love between an emperor and his queen, the loyalty between leader and followers, the courage to choose the path that does not yet exist. These simple human experiences continue to resonate, eternal elements in the symphony of consciousness that plays across infinite dimensions and endless time. Thus concludes the testament of Kellen Vorthok, last emperor of Zevpria, first citizen of the Weave, eternal participant in the collaborative dream that reality has always been, is now, and ever shall be.